it is part of a region. And in the region, the overriding dynamic right now is a rivalry between the regional superpowers, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And essentially, Saudi Arabia is holding Bahrain in a chokehold, having sent its troops there, controlling its economy in many ways, being able to provide or withhold funding. And the Bahraini regime, in a way, doesn't mind being in that chokehold. Well, bottom line is it wouldn't want that, but it feels that the Saudi Arabia is providing necessary protection in what it sees as an existential crisis. The threat being the Iranians across the Gulf. Now, the Basuni report already said Iran didn't play a role, even if it took advantage of things. There is no question that the Iranians would love to see the Bahraini opposition win. But there's also a clear understanding on the part of the opposition in Bahrain, maybe not so much among the broader population and the street protesters, but certainly among the opposition, that Bahrain will stay firmly within the Saudi orbit, that there is no chance that it would leave that orbit, least of all that it would join or come to fall under the Iranian sphere of influence somehow. Secondly, the United States and the United Kingdom in particular, which have strong historic roles in Bahrain, and of course at present the United States has its Fifth Fleet there, and other assets, they seem to be distressed by the events that have taken place. But at the same time, and this is strategically is of the main importance, is that they also see Iran as the enemy in the Gulf, and therefore they find themselves on the side of the regime in terms of keeping Iran at bay. Though the argument they make is that by putting Saudi troops into Bahrain and suppressing peaceful protesters, you actually help the Iranians rather than hold them at bay. And so a smarter strategy would be to pursue political reform. But the approach they take is a highly gradualist one, and it boils down basically to, listen, it would be better for you and for all of us if you were to pursue gradual reform. If you crack down on protesters again, then we might have to go public and become much more outspoken about what we really feel about how you deal with the political situation. In other words, a future threat. The United States also is concerned about Saudi Arabia. The fall of Hosni Mubarak caused an earthquake in Saudi Arabia, and triggered a very defensive response that is still very active today. And the United States cannot afford to lose its Saudi ally unless there were to be real change in Saudi Arabia itself. Well, we've seen some protests in the eastern province, just across the causeway from Bahrain, but we haven't seen any significant Arab Spring in Riyadh. So the prospect of that is limited at the moment, and I think that the momentum, therefore, is still with the Saudis in this equation. So I expect little concrete action. What can happen? Well, finally, the government of Bahrain seems to be, let's say, subject to pressure and willing to give in to some of that pressure, or being forced to give in to some of that pressure, as we have seen by the measures it has taken, including the Basuni Commission. It must also be extremely concerned about the regional situation. The situation in Syria it's unclear where this will go and what kind of effects it will have in the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and maybe down in the Gulf. The situation in Egypt remains highly unsettled. And so it has to worry about what will happen next, and therefore it must respond to some extent to the legitimate demands of at least the legitimate demands of the protesters and the opposition. So there's pressure from those two external factors, and internally, of course, the protests are not necessarily abating. They're not at the same intensity as they were a year ago, but daily there are protests in Shia villages, and as we speak, protesters are still trying to get back into Manama and close to the former Pearl roundabout. So change will come from this combination of pressures eventually, but it will not come without further pain and suffering. And the important thing now is to seek to re-empower those who were genuinely pursuing dialogue in the past. And I think that is the focus of the talk by Jean-Francois. So I'm going to leave him now my place, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's, of course, a great topic. And we have many friends here who would love to hear some very positive things about Bahrain. Some of it may not be as positive as we want, but we do have a lot of wishful thinking on this part anyway. And I really thank Joost for his presentation. I think it's, in my view, very accurate. Definitely the Bassiouni report is truly fantastic. It actually reads almost like a novel. It's like a page turner, it's kind of things you buy in airports to read on the airplane, except it's 600 pages long. But it does, I was very surprised that they came up with something so good and so detailed, actually. So in any event, yes, there is a lot of recommendations in there. Most of them are being looked at by the government. There has been the announcement and the commission and so on. My fear is that it's purely cosmetic. In fact, I probably believe that the king named the Bassiouni report solely to appease the West, with the full understanding that they would never implement it. That's the kind of situation the Bahraini leadership has had as long as I can remember. I mean, torture in Bahrain is not new. When we lived there in the 70s, there were tortures in Bahrain. There were people in jail, arrested in the middle of the night. It's been for a long, long time. It was just not triggered a year ago. It's been building over the years. So there has to be a lot of efforts to reconcile the communities. Unfortunately, in many ways, the communities had been more or less reconciled at one point, and the difference between Sunni and Shia really wasn't there for a long, long time. And of course, now because of the pressures, that is coming back to be there. But let me say that I'm still relatively optimistic. I think there is room for reconciliation. I would like to think there is room for reconciliation. Maybe I'm thinking it should rather than it will. But so if you bear with me, I have a couple things to just mention on that. It seems to me that working from the Bassiouni report and learning an enormous amount from the Bassiouni report and from so many people who have been doing so much work, like your organization, Joost, on Bahrain, that there are possibilities. I think I'm not going to go through too many details because it's so complex. But let me just say I think there are three keys to the reconciliation effort. One is there has to be a recognition by all the parties involved, but especially by the royal family, that there's a need for a real constitutional monarchy, not a sham constitutional monarchy. If you ask the king and the prime minister and so on 2 years ago, they would say, we have a constitutional monarchy, which was, of course, a bit of a joke, but a real one. Just like, in my view, the crown prince was trying to establish until March 13th and 14th of last year, and which fell through. That would imply, though, the recognition of the need for a real constitutional monarchy by the leadership means that you'd have to remove the most extreme elements of repression within the leadership. There is a very strong element under the prime minister in particular, not necessarily himself, but under him, who really sees a good Shia as a dead Shia. Let's face it, I mean, to use an old joke, which we used to say, which is really not a joke, but about integration in the South here. You really have to get people to work together and remove the people who want this oppression to continue. The second point would be to form a government of national unity.